Welcome back, everyone. In this video, we are going to be talking about the 3 Sony G Master wide-angle prime lenses. I'm really excited that Sony wanted to sponsor this video. I actually own and use all 3 of these lenses for both stills and video. In fact, they are 3 of my favorite prime lenses on any system. So we're talking about the 35mm f1.4 G Master, the 24mm f1.4 G Master, as well as the 14mm f1.8 G Master ultra-wide-angle lens. So these are all Sony's top-of-the-line G Master lenses, and they all share common aspects of extremely high performance in a relatively compact package. All 3 lenses have features that you'd expect on a G Master lens, so we're talking about physical aperture rings, they all have custom function buttons. All 3 of these lenses also have very high-performance optical designs. They incorporate Sony's XA, or extreme aspherical lens elements, as well as other special-purpose glass elements. So the first lens of these to be released was the 24mm f1.4. This came out in 2018. You can see when you look at these next to one another that these were really conceived to complement one another, and the size and weight of all 3 lenses pretty much nearly the same, and they're very compact. This is extremely important when you need to travel and you've got a camera bag and you don't want a lot of weight with you. This makes it really easy. And what's particularly notable about each one of these lenses is there really isn't any compromise with size in terms of image quality or even speed with autofocus performance. So when the 24mm G Master was released, and I've said this before, this was a real watershed lens for Sony. They had nice lenses before, but this one kind of launched them into a new era of this whole idea of a really compact size with incredible performance. This was followed by some of the telephoto lenses, and then much later on we got the 35mm and the 14mm, but this was kind of the first to start that realization. Up to that point, I had used other 24mm lenses, usually on DSLR systems, and this was the first one for mirrorless. And I remember at the time thinking, this is just mind-blowing in the sense that this is by far the best 24mm I have used on any system. I pre-ordered it immediately, could not wait for it to come, and it's one I've shot on constantly ever since. The autofocus in this lens is a DDSM system, or direct drive supersonic motor, and so this actually led later to the XD linear motors that we see in the other lenses. It's still really fast and was a performance benchmark for mirrorless cameras. It's extremely quiet and it keeps up quite well if you're using autofocus in a video type application. This lens is one of my go-to lenses for landscape photography. You get super sharp images, they have excellent contrast control, and the color rendering is really nice as well. Plus, it's small, so you carry way less weight. This is extremely important if you've got any extensive hiking you have to do to get somewhere. I typically use this on my A7R IV, but you could go even more compact with this system. If you don't mind less resolution, you could go with the A7C. The 24mm is also exceptional for environmental portraits. Features a beautiful bokeh rendering and a really nice contrast separation when you're using a really shallow depth of field. For me, Sony sort of redefined the 24mm lens as kind of an essential prime. You know, when you think of essential prime lenses, 50s, 35s, when I bought this lens, for me at least, it started replacing my use of the 35. It really is that good. Another major benchmark of this lens would be astrophotography. I actually had a chance to shoot in Sedona a few years ago. I used this lens and also another much more expensive lens, which didn't perform nearly as well for astro. So when optical designers set out to design a lens, they're usually looking to make a lot of corrections that occur when you're putting optics together. And one of those corrections that's very difficult, especially on a 24mm focal length, is this idea of something called coma. Now, if you're not familiar with coma, if you look at an image that has small points of light in it at the edges of the frame, so for instance stars in an astro shot, a lot of times when you have coma present, it makes them go from small dots that look like stars to having things like growing wings. This is essentially coma that hasn't been corrected so well. So I was using this lens and another much more expensive lens, and the expensive lens exhibited quite a bit of coma, as you can see in these images. The 24mm G Master does not. Obviously, this is something you're not going to correct 100%, but the way that this corrects it is pretty darn close. I'll come back to this in a second, but all 3 of these lenses are exceptional performers for astrophotography. So let's look at the 14mm f1.8. So the first thing you're going to notice is the size of this lens. It's actually much smaller and lighter than what you would expect it to be, and this first made me curious about the performance and what the trade-offs were going to be, especially since this lens was following the release of the 12 to 24mm G Master, which is one of the best performing zoom lenses I've ever used. This lens is actually pleasantly surprising. It's got very low distortion, and you get the added benefit of f1.8. The 12 to 24 millimeter is an incredible zoom lens, but since it's a zoom, it is an f2.8. I love using this lens for interiors where you're in super tight spaces. It's got such minimal distortion, it really gives you a natural look. It's almost focal length neutral in that sense. It's also great for urban landscapes. I was also really impressed on how this lens handles vignetting. This was a concern just because it's so compact. I figured that would be a trade-off. There's a little bit of vignetting, but it's easily correctable in post. It's really impressively designed. Another really cool thing about the 14mm G Master is, first of all, it is an f1.8, so it's a pretty wide aperture for a lens this wide. The other cool thing is that it's got a close focus distance of about 9.8 inches, so you can get bokeh and actually a pretty shallow depth of field if your subject is near the camera. This is something you wouldn't expect with most 14mm lenses. It also has a circular 9-blade aperture diaphragm, so when you stop down, you're still going to get your spherical highlights round. This lens does feature two XD linear autofocus motors. It's the fastest ultra-wide-angle autofocus I've ever used. This is, again, really extremely useful if you're using it in a video application. And if you're wondering about the 14mm for astrophotography, well, I don't have any Milky Way shots, but I did set this up in the front yard the other night, and I was actually very impressed with what it was able to pick up. And of course, if we zoom to the corners, you're not going to see much coma going on in any of these points of light. And once again, it's a small lens, so if you're going to be traveling and doing astro and things like that, there's a lot to be said for it being compact. So this brings us to the 35mm f1.4 G Master, which I think this lens is actually one of the crown jewels in the Sony lineup. It's an essential focal length. When you think of essential primes, you typically think of 50 and definitely 35. This is an incredible lens for using for street photography and your kind of documentary work. Anything where you need to get close up, but you don't really want to go too wide with it. This is really great focal length. Think of all the incredible pictures in the history of street photography that have been taken with a 35mm lens. And the 35mm f1.4 G Master falls right into that lineage. This is one of my favorite optical designs. The images you're going to get off of this are absolutely stunning. And you get some added benefits that you don't have on some classic lens designs, such as close-up shooting. And again, there's practically no distortion, so it ends up being an extremely versatile lens. Contrast and color reproduction are outstanding. This lens actually uses the Sony Nano AR Coating 2, which we first saw in the 12 to 24mm zoom lens, but this gives you excellent suppression of both flare and ghosting. You've got 11 circular aperture blades, so even if you stop down, the bokeh stays round, and the contrast is exceptional shooting wide open. And when we talk about the look, you're gonna want to use this lens wide open most of the time. It just gives you a really beautiful separation between your subject and your background, especially at a 35mm focal length. And once again, to mention size and weight, well, this is a 35mm lens. It gets a lot of use, and it just kind of lives on my camera, and it's always ready to go. And once again, for astro shooting, I know it's not the Milky Way, but if we go into the corners, you can see that it once again handles coma exceptionally well. So I keep mentioning high performance on all three of these lenses. Now, what does that mean? Is that a subjective term? Because a lot of times you'll hear people say, oh, well, this lens is really sharp, or it doesn't get any sharper than this. Well, sharp can be a subjective term, so how do we put this into something that's a little more objective? So one thing you can do is look at MTF charts, and I'm not a huge fan of doing those in my videos because, one, if you don't understand what they mean, they're kind of boring. Two, they're theoretical. And three, I think they are only useful if you're having a discussion about something and you want to refer to them. So how can we actually test the performance of these lenses? So one thing I like to do in all of my lens reviews is to actually take a look at the field of focus, and there's a really easy way to visualize this. So what is the field of focus? Well, if you focus on something, you think of a straight line going across the frame, and anything that is in that straight line would be in focus. If something is behind that line, it'll be out of focus, or if it's in front of that line, it would be out of focus. And so that focus depth changes depending on where your aperture is set. So the further you stop the lens down, the more it becomes in focus. So I do all these tests wide open on the lens at its widest aperture. So what you need to do this, and you can do this at home with any lens, is I just need to take a picture of something with texture in it because we're going to be looking at how sharp it is. So what I do is I shoot asphalt, or in this case it's just the street, and then what I do is I take this into Photoshop and I use something called the Find Edges filter. Now the Find Edges filter has no options on it. It's just going to take anything that is of high contrast or sharpness in the photograph, and it's going to make that dark. Anything that's of a lower contrast, it will go off to white, and there's a little bit of a gradient between them. But if I throw this filter on an image, you can actually see what that field of focus looks like. Now, one thing that's very difficult in lens design design, especially with wider angle lenses, is keeping that field straight. We assume it's straight, but in a lot of cases, it can have something called a mustache wave pattern. There's different things, and so it's actually turning that focus in and out, and it's not perfectly straight. The other thing you want to look for is a lot of times you'll look at a lens using this technique, and you can see that that sharpness falls off considerably as you go toward the edges. Now, that is actually normal, and no lens is ever going to be perfect, but if we look at the Sony lenses, so for instance, the 35mm f1.4 G Master, this line is extremely straight. It's also very dark all the way to the edges, so I can tell that this is going to be a very high-performing lens. Same with the 24mm f1.4. The 14 is going to be the widest of the bunch, and it does have a little fall off at the sides, but if you compare this with other ultra-wide-angle lenses, it actually performs extraordinarily well. Another big plus for all three of these lenses is the way they're priced. So if you think of flagship lenses from any top lens manufacturer, I mean, I've seen lenses $4,000 and up, and these are all coming in well under $2,000, and I think they make a lot of sense for anybody considering wide angles in their kit. Another thing that I want to point out is Sony is the only manufacturer doing mirrorless right now with these types of lenses. So I know Nikon has a 35mm and a 24mm, they're f1.8s. At this point, Canon has the 35mm, again, it's an f1.8, and it's not on the level these are. The only option you would have with another system is going with Sigma or something, and there are differences there as well. So these lenses make the most sense for me in a mirrorless system, and I use these all the time. So if you have any questions, I'd love to hear from you, so drop a comment below. I'll catch you guys in the next video. Until then, later.